Today we are joined by Audrey Davis, the director of the Alexandria Black History Museum in Alexandria, Virginia. Ms. Davis is the past president of the Virginia Associations of Museum Council, and she is one of the founders and the current president of Virginia Africana Associates, Inc. In 2016, the Washington Business Journal listed Ms. Davis on their top 100 list of Washington power players, and in 2021, Ms. Davis was appointed to the board of directors for the American Civil War Museum. She is a former gubernatorial appointee to the board of directors for Virginia Humanities and is currently a member of their Commonwealth Humanities Circle. In 2018, Ms. Davis was appointed by Virginia Governor Terry McAuliffe to the Task Force for the Identification of the History of Formerly Enslaved African Americans in Virginia. And in 2016, she was appointed by Virginia Governor Terry McAuliffe to the State Historical Records Advisory Board. And then she was reappointed to this board in 2018 and 2021 by Governor Ralph Northam. And so that's her sixth gubernatorial appointment. She's been featured in WETA documentaries Discovering Alexandria, Parts 1 and 2, Martyrs, Mayhem, and Martial Law, Life in Civil War Alexandria, and she was an on-set historical consultant for the PBS drama Mercy Street, which premiered nationally in 2016 and ran for 2 seasons, if anyone's seen that. And so in 2022, she was the recipient of the City of Alexandria's Martin Luther King Jr. Spirit Award for her work on the preservation of Freedom House, now a museum on Alexandria's role on the domestic slave trade, and equity initiatives for promoting and preserving African American history in Alexandria, Virginia. So we are so happy to have you here today to tell us more about the journey to freedom, Alexandria's contraband history, and we have clearly the expert person to be doing that today. So welcome, and I'll turn it over to you.
Oh, great, thank you. Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, everyone. I'm so pleased to be here. It's my first time at the Army Museum, so I'm looking forward to being able to look around a bit after the talk is over. But I am so pleased to share this is more kind of a mediation on Alexandria's contraband history and how it sort of impacted my career. This is 2023, so it's now my 30th year with the City of Alexandria. And it's funny, when you first get hired, you never think that you're actually going to be there for a number of years. So it kind of creeps up on you. But I'm so excited to share this history with you. And we'll start on my first slide. That was taken around 1990, and I actually joined the City of Alexandria in June of 1993. And this is looking at the corner of South Washington Street and Church Streets. And if you were in Alexandria anytime before 2007, you probably remember this office building and more probably the gas station, which was right before you got on the GW Parkway. So it's sort of like your last chance to get gas before you headed out to Mount Vernon. And I often used to get gas here at this mobile station, not knowing that I was actually standing on the burial ground of over 1,800 contraband or escaped slaves, men, women, and children, who were buried at this site. And the story of how we actually came to establish our Contraband and Freedmen's Memorial is a really interesting story and involves a lot of people and our whole Alexandria community. When we first started, we were getting ready in the 90s to have the impact of the Woodrow Wilson Bridge coming in, and we were looking, and we had volunteers, one especially, who had discovered the story of Alexandria's contrabands. And that led, and her interest and her galvanizing the city led to our division, Alexandria Archaeology, which is a part of the division of the Office of Historic Alexandria, where I work, to do some very quiet test digs. And so these were done in the late 90s, and I was privy to being there for some of them. And it was when really we found the first evidence that there might be something that still survives underground. I believe on the dig I was there for, they found a man's shirt button, and what they thought possibly might have been evidence of a coffin handle. So it was really exciting to know that there was something there and that there was something to pursue. And we were very excited to begin that process. But we do have to go back to the beginning, to the Civil War beginning, and to 3 enslaved men who came to Fortress Monroe seeking asylum under General Benjamin Franklin Butler in May of 1861. Now, Butler had only arrived at the fort just shortly before these three men got in a rowboat and rowed the enslaved men and rowed over. They were Frank Baker, James Townsend, and Shepard Mallory. And they were seeking asylum because they knew that the person who held them in bondage was going to be moving them to North Carolina from the Hampton Roads area. They were already working for the Confederate cause through the man who held them in bondage, but they were really frightened that they were never going to see their families again, which was a good chance that would happen. So they took a huge risk. I mean, punishment would have been severe for these men, and they came to Butler seeking asylum. And Butler, just getting to Fortress Monroe, had to think about it. What should he do? I mean, he knew legally, he was a lawyer, what he should do. He should send them back to their owners due to the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850. But he thought that really would be sort of a very stupid move, because their labor is only going to aid the Confederate cause. So why not keep them, make them contraband of war, allow them to work for the Union cause, give them a chance at freedom and a chance to earn a wage, and keep them and have them work for him. So when Butler did this, many scholars are now reevaluating the fact that he did this and what it has done for the Civil War and hastening the end of the war, because word of mouth spread about what had happened for the three enslaved men. And they said just 5 days later, they had almost 500 people at Fortress Monroe, and the numbers continued to continually rise. And so we know that these were people coming from everywhere seeking freedom. And we also know that it happened in Alexandria, Virginia, too. Just to give you an image of Alexandria from 1863, we were also occupied by the Union in May of 1861. And it's said that word quickly spread by word of mouth. And so that you see many slaves taking the risk and self-emancipating. This is a proactive move, coming to Union lines because they know they have a chance to live free, to earn a wage, to be with their families. But we know that many of those who came to Alexandria seeking freedom did not live long in it. We talk about contrabands and self-emancipation quite a bit in our history of Alexandria. We are really looking and turning a lens inward on our African-American history in our department. We want to talk about African-American agency, that enslaved African-Americans were not passive, that often when they had the opportunity, they took the opportunity to try to get to freedom. We know that many people know our infamous slave pen at 1315 Duke Street, and you're seeing a picture of it now where it says Price, Birch and Company. We had 5 different dealers operating out of this site between 1828 and 1861, when the last enslaved man was left chained in that building. We also know that this building was used during the Union occupation to house contraband. And for many years, people always talk about the picture of the woman in the courtyard that you see. And she's in the courtyard of what was believed to be 1315 Duke Street. And I like to use this picture because it talks about how I can talk about how history changes all the time. For years, we have interpreted this picture as this woman standing in the courtyard of Freedom House, that you could see through the gate, the Union soldiers, the 2 Union soldiers in the distance. But I have a colleague who's doing new research and now believes there's a different location for this picture. And he's only just discovered this in the last month. And we still believe it's on the same block, but we don't necessarily believe it's 1315 Duke Street. And we are investigating that. And we hope to give a presentation on this picture next year as he builds more information. But we know that the contraband coming into Alexandria created a humanitarian crisis, and that there were people who were sent to aid the contraband, one of those being Harriet Jacobs. She, with a nurse, Julia Wilbur, actually spent a lot of time in Alexandria aiding the contraband. And Julia Wilbur, you can find out if you read her letters about the contraband, you can find out her history and how she felt about Alexandria. Now, I think Harriet Jacobs is an amazing person because not only did she aid the contraband in Alexandria and in DC and in other areas, but she was also held as an enslaved woman for many years. And she was a very interesting proponent for African-American female agency, that because she was an enslaved woman, she did not have to submit to sexual advances by the person who owned her. So to protect her children, whom she had with a white lawyer in her town, because she felt like she should have children with whomever she loved and or felt that she wanted to have a relationship with. But she also knew that she couldn't stay safe from the person who enslaved her. So she hid in a garret that was only about 4 feet high for 7 years. So she could see her children, she could hear them playing. They would send up food to her, knitting, reading. She had air holes so she could breathe, but she was there for 7 years until she could safely escape from Edenton, North Carolina. And she said that when she came out, she had very poor eyesight. She had neuropathy for the rest of her days. She froze in the winter. She sweltered in the summer, but it was so important to her to be able to have that connection to her children and then to be able to safely get herself and them out of Edenton, North Carolina. And I think about her when I think about what she went through and saying that, I'm kind of done. I sort of, she wrote her book, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, which she published under a pseudonym because she talked freely, not only about what happened to the enslaved, but also the sexual exploitation that happened to the enslaved. And she published it under pseudonym because she was embarrassed to be brutally honest about what happened to her and what happened in her life. But I would think, after all of this, and then to come and then to give of yourself and to aid those who are in a worse situation than you are now, she was very, very generous in spirit to do this. And she brought her daughter with her to Alexandria. And not only did they aid the contraband, they also set up contraband schools in Alexandria as well. I also bring a picture, Slaves of Fallujah. It's a period image that is from Alexandria. We actually lost this, unfortunately, in a bidding war with the National Museum of African American History and Culture. But if you go there to the National Museum on the lower level, you will see this photograph in the section where they are talking about the contraband history. And I think it's just a lovely photograph. And one of my colleagues, Amy Birch, has done a really wonderful deep dive into this image and can identify everyone in this picture and tell you the history. So if you Google Amy Birch and Slaves at Fallujah, you will find a deeper dive into this and really incredible image. We know that the contraband in Alexandria were working at the wharf. They were working for the railroad. Contraband women were serving as laundresses. They were serving as cooks. They were trying to earn a wage any way they can, and they were supporting the economy of the city. But as I was saying, we were an occupied city at the time, and there was a great humanitarian crisis. There was dysentery, there was smallpox, there was cholera, there was a lot of disease, and the contraband were dying at a great rate in the city. And as a result, in 1864, the military was in Alexandria, and the Army decided to build Louverture Hospital. And this was an hospital for the United States colored troops and for the contraband. We also know our Shiloh Baptist Church evolved out of the Louverture Hospital location. And also they built the barracks, the Freedmen's Barracks. But we know that the deaths continue to rise. And almost half of these deaths that we're seeing were children under the age of 16 that were succumbing. So the military appointed a Reverend Albert Gladwin as superintendent of the cemetery. And one of the things that Reverend Gladwin did, or had his subordinates do, was keep a ledger. And this ledger, the Book of Records, is an amazing document. And if you don't know about it, I think if you're studying slavery, this is really a must-see document. You will find it in the Library of Virginia. And I'm proud to say that our department and our Division of Archaeology actually fundraised to have this book restored in 2014. So we're very proud of that. But the Book of Records containing marriages and deaths that have occurred within the official jurisdiction of Reverend Albert Gladwin is just an amazing document, because what it does is that whoever was recording the deaths recorded the date of the death, the first and last name of the person, their age, when we knew it, what they died of, or when they knew it, what they died of, and where they died in the city. You do not get that kind of information about an enslaved population very regularly. And it has allowed a genealogist that we have worked with to find over 1,000 descendants related to those who were buried at Alexandria's Contraband Cemetery. And it also tells us about some of the more moving stories that we have about the Contraband Cemetery. Now, that ledger also included, as it said, marriages and births. It also included mundane things like how much coffin hardware they had to buy, how many coffins they bought, how many screws and latches and things. But it is an incredible, incredible document. But one of the things that happened with the United States colored troops that were dying at Louverture hospitals, that they were being buried in the Contraband cemetery. And their compatriots who were alive and who were outraged at this because they considered the Contraband cemetery to be a pauper's grave, and that these were military men. These were members of the Army, and they deserved to be buried in Alexandria Soldier Cemetery or National Cemetery. And so they did something that was extraordinary. Their compatriots, over 400 of them, wrote a petition to the Army requesting that their compatriots who died be buried in the Alexandria National Cemetery. They say that we have cheerfully served on the battlefields of war with white soldiers, and that they expected in death to be accorded the same honor. And the military accepted that petition, and 118 men who were buried at the Contraband cemetery were reinterred in Alexandria's National Cemetery. And you can find their burials there today. We had a wreath laying last year, which was incredibly moving. And you're seeing one of my favorite photographs that to me is just, it's one of the things when you work in a museum that you always tell people to do when you take a photograph, is to write the first and last name of everybody in the photograph in the order that they were standing in, especially say if it's a high school photograph, because I guarantee you in 25 years, you're not going to remember every name of every person in that photograph. So the aid worker who was at Louverture Hospital had this picture taken, did that very thing. So we know what happened to every single man in this photograph, which is extraordinary. Charles Joyce, the former owner of this photograph, has done research, and if you Google his name, you will find an article that he wrote for Civil War Times about the history of each of the men in this photograph. We know for a fact that the piccolo player, to me on my left side, actually died shortly after this picture was taken. We know the gentleman in the hat is Chauncey Leonard, who set up contraband schools, not only in Alexandria, but also in Washington, D.C., and also wrote about the contraband. We also know from Harriet Jacobs and her writings that she attended a funeral for a gentleman, not a member of the USCT, but it's one of the oldest men that we have on the Gladwin record, or the book of records, the ledger. And when he died, the whole community came out for his funeral. There were hundreds of people there. And they came because he really acted as an aid worker, even when he had lost so much himself, because during slavery, his wife and his daughters were sold away from him. So he had no idea where they were. And then his 4 sons joined up with the USCT. So at the time of his death, his sons were scattered around the country, and they had no idea where he was, and he had no idea where they were. So he was really essentially alone. And so she writes about this very movingly, and about how she comes across this funeral and that the whole community was there, and that before he died, Peter Washington was the gentleman's name. He said that if it were not for his faith and that his desire to see other contraband succeed, that he would have given up and died. And I think it's those stories, the petition and the story about Peter Washington, are 2 of the most moving stories that we have with our cemetery. This is just showing you a bit of the petition, and just another image of United States colored troops at Fort Lincoln in Washington, D.C. We do know that with most cemeteries, I'm going to go back just a second. So if you look at the soldier cemetery, what do you see? You see a white picket fence, and the markers that you see then are not all stone. Some are actually wood. So at the Contraband cemetery, we know that there was a white picket fence, and most of the head markers were wood. Now, what happens over time, and if the cemetery is not maintained, the fence disintegrates, the markers disintegrate. And after a while, even though we know burials actually occurred up until 1869, and we know that this cemetery appears on city maps up until 1948, people begin to forget about it. Now, this article that we have is from 1900, and it talks about people mining the cemetery for clay for bricks and disturbing the graves, and that skeletons are being seen and coffins are sticking out like cannons, and someone's walking out with a shoulder blade over their shoulder. And so you're seeing that this area is being desecrated, in the 1900s. And so, in one of the articles we see about the cemetery, they say that, all of the houses in Old Town should be haunted if they're made by bricks from this cemetery that belonged to the contraband. But we know that the desecration of the site continued. The site for the cemetery was taken from confiscated land from a Confederate sympathizer. The family eventually gets the land back, but it's a cemetery, so what are you going to do with the land? Eventually, it falls into the hands of the Catholic Diocese of Richmond. They have it for a period of time, and then they sell it. And when they sell it, they have two provisions. One, that there never be a building built that serves alcohol on the site, and two, that there never be a gas station on the site. 1955, what goes in? A gas station. And then later we have the office building that goes in. So even though we know as of 1948, this really still was noted as a Black cemetery. Well, it comes to two women who are amazing community leaders who didn't plan to be that way. Lily Finkley was a volunteer at Alexandria Archaeology who was doing research. And she found Wesley Pippinger's book on the Gladwin record, where he had transcribed the whole record. And she asked our city archaeologist at the time, Dr. Pamela Cressy, about this. And she thought it was an outrage that there were buildings on top of a burial ground. So she enlisted her friend, Louise Massoud, and they decided that they were going to fight this, and they were going to be a part. And at every council meeting and every meeting about the Woodrow Wilson Bridge, Louise said they were so naive that when they first started, she just called up Mobil, the headquarters, and said, "You've got a gas station on our cemetery. We'd like you to remove it," and expecting them to act. It took years, but they were absolutely triumphant in their success. And what you're seeing in this picture is them being interviewed by Channel 7 in 2007, when the city purchased the property and demolished the office building and the gas station, which we were really excited about. And because of that, they started the Friends of the Freedmen Cemetery organization, and they would have remembrances there every Memorial Day, even while the gas station was there. And the gas station owner, I have to say, was really wonderful to the Friends of the Freedmen Cemetery. And the city did make him whole for taking his property. But it was really just a labor of love for them and so many people in the community. Even though the cemetery there, they would put up signs, and this was one of their early signs, and their wreaths were always destroyed and thrown, over the fence. And people were horrible, but they persevered, which I think was really terrific. In 2000, they got a state historic marker noting the site, and that's another thing that Lily was just so proud about. And I am just so proud of this and Lily, because Lily died in January of this year. And so she was hailed and lauded in Alexandria as one of the leading African-American female preservationists in our city. So she was a wonderful force. And this is the demolition of the gas station and the office building in 2007. And then after the demolition, archaeology began in earnest to find out what was there. Oh, and actually, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. But before that, the night before the archaeology began, there was a rededication ceremony. And because we had the record as part of a community program, we invited community members to make a luminary bag for every person that we knew in the record. And we lit them that night. And so people came into the Black History Museum, to Alexandria Archaeology, to other sites. They got a sticker with a name on it, and they created a luminary bag in remembrance of the person. And we had a really lovely ceremony to honor those who did not live long in freedom and who are buried at that site. This is just a close-up of some of the luminary bags, and we still have them all archived. You can find them on our website. They're really, really lovely. But then the archaeology began. And so you can see the trenches and you can see the outlines. We've highlighted it a bit so you can see where you can see the coffin outline. People ask us, how deep did you dig? Did you find bones and skeletons? And because this site was so desecrated, there was a decision that it was going to go to that surface level so we could know that there was a burial shaft there, but we were not going to disturb burials any longer. But you can see where the coffin hardware is on either side of the picture that has the string that's outlining the shape of the coffin, and you can see a drawing of the latch that would allow you to lift the lid. We now know that there are over 600 existing burial shafts at the Contraband and Freedmen's Cemetery Memorial. Our genealogist was Shaw McCargo Baugh. She was hired by the city, and she wrote a book, Alexandria's Freedmen's Cemetery, A Legacy of Freedom, and she found over 1,000 descendants related to those buried at the Contraband and Freedmen's Cemetery. Most recently, she has been working with the Virginia Theological Seminary on their research and reparations work, and she's also been working with us, and she has uncovered descendants of our 2 documented lynching victims in Alexandria, Joseph McCoy, lynched in 1897, and Benjamin Thomas, lynched in 1899. This was a really proud day for me because I had wanted Lily and Louise to be the first 2 people walking into the Contraband and Freedmen's Cemetery Memorial when it was dedicated in September 2014. And it was a very, very proud moment for all of us in the city to see them there. And then in July of 2021, because of the petition that the USCT wrote, we were accepted into the National Park Service's African American Civil Rights Network. And we were very proud of being inducted into that network. And we had over 100 people show up at the cemetery as we celebrated that moment. The dedicated memorial has a beautiful sculpture by Mario Chiodo, The Path of Thorns and Roses, which to me is a beautiful evocation of the sorrow and the hopeless feeling of grief, but also the fact that out of deep grief and out of deep suffering, there can be hope and there can be survival. And then we have beautiful bas-relief that are done by the late Joanna Blake. Tragically, Joanna, who is a sculptor who's 36 years old, was killed in a motorcycle accident in Italy shortly after the memorial was dedicated. But if you do go to her website, she worked on memorials all over the DMV and all over the country. She did the Battle of Bladensburg Memorial, and she also worked on the World War II Memorial. She leaves behind, at that time, she left behind a 5-year-old daughter, but truly, truly a tragic loss. And I love the bas-relief. If you look at the people in the bas-relief, they're all her neighbors and friends. And she actually made the outfits that they wore. And the older woman who's kneeling, struggling to get to freedom, she came to the dedication. And a lot of her friends were there for the dedication. So we were so proud to celebrate with Joanna. This is a more detailed look. And we have recreated inside the memorial the names from the ledger. So you can find all the names from the ledger, and you see the round circles that are by the names. And those are actually a descendant link. So we add one and we give a link to the family member anytime we discover a new family member who's related to the cemetery. And also, I just wanted to go back for a minute. When you enter the cemetery, you're actually traveling on the original carriage path that would bring the bodies into the cemetery. And you can't see it from this slide, but the brick now, we've discovered since the memorial was dedicated, more burials in the sidewalk. So there are pieces of light colored brick as you walk in, and those light colored bricks indicate another burial that has been found. But I want to talk a minute before I conclude just about what we're doing in Alexandria and what we're doing not only for social justice, but to illuminate and to elevate the African-American voice. I showed you the picture earlier of the old slave pen with Price and Birch. That is the building you're looking at now in gray. It is it's called the Freedom House when it was owned by the Northern Virginia Urban League. During the pandemic, I mean, what else do you do during a pandemic? If you're a city, you buy a building, and the city bought in 2020, March of 2020, 1315 Duke Street. And our goal is to interpret this site as a museum to the domestic slave trade, because Alexandria really was ground zero for the internal domestic slave trade in this country. Right now, we opened on Juneteenth of last year temporarily. We have temporary exhibits up, and I'm just showing you one picture of it. The map on the floor shows you the route that the different dealers would take in Alexandria. We now have 3 floors of history. If you've been there before, the Northern Virginia Urban League opened an exhibit in 2008, which was really wonderful. And we came in 2018 to help them manage their museum. But their exhibit was in the basement and it was not accessible to all. So when we took over the building, we now have history on all 3 floors. We have an elevator, so we're fully accessible for everyone. And we encourage you to come because we give you history not only of the domestic slave trade, of the Civil War use of the building, but also contemporary history, because African Americans are not just defined by the worst moment, by slavery, but they're defined, we want to be defined by our achievement, by our goals. And so you'll see that throughout the museum. This is just a close-up to give you an idea of some of the exhibits. Howard Revis, the firm that designed our Contraband and Freedmen Cemetery Memorial, has done our initial exhibits on the first floor, and they've done an excellent job. I also want to talk briefly about the Alexandria Black History Museum, which is my museum. And this museum dates to 1940. And the building, the smaller triangle that you see, the smaller roof triangle, was in 1940 was built as the segregated library for African Americans after the historic 1939 sit-in that occurred on August 21st, 1939. There's now a new book out called Public in Name Only that talks about that sit-in, and we will have a lecture with the author, Dr. Brenda Mitchell-Powell in Alexandria on April 16th. We also know that the National Library Association has said that the sit-in that occurred in the Alexandria Library in 1939 was the first sit-in for African American civil rights in an American public library. We also have our Watson Reading Room. Our complex is actually three facilities: the museum, the reading room, which is a non-circulating reading room, which has over 4,000 volumes on African and African American history, and also our African American Heritage Park, which interprets an 1885 burial ground, but also has these amazing bronze trees by the sculptor Jerome Meadows, called Truths That Rise from the Roots Remembered. And these trees on the sides are etched with the names and places, African Americans who made a difference and their organizations that made a difference within the city of Alexandria. Also at our museum right now, I wanted to highlight our new exhibition. We reopened after being closed for almost 3 years in February, and what we are hosting is our Black Lives Remembered collection. And this was our response to what happened in May of 2020 after the death of George Floyd. We asked the community to share with us the vigils that they participated in, the protests that they participated in, posters that they made, places that they went to. And so we have over 300 images now in our database, and we're still actively collecting. And so if you have something that you would like to donate to us, we would love to see it. And the way that this exhibit is designed with multiple monitors around the gallery, we can add your item. You can donate something to us, and we can add it within the next week and have it be part of the exhibit, which is really cool. And all of our artists and photographers retain the copyright to their images, so you don't have to worry about losing rights, because as part of our work with the city, we are very intentional that those artists who donate to us retain their copyright and their rights to the work that they have produced. We also have paintings by Sherry Sanabria. Sherry died in 2014, but she was an amazing painter. And so her family donated 23 paintings to us at the Black History Museum. Half are at Freedom House and half are out at my museum, the Black History Museum. And they are incredibly beautiful images of African American heritage sites around the country that she documented before her death. She was born in DC, had a studio briefly at the Torpedo Factory, and then she and her husband, who's a sculptor, lived in Leesburg, Virginia. Oh, and I think this is Jennifer's slide. But before I close, I just wanted to say one thing and show you one thing. This is something I keep by my desk, and it's kind of faded, but it says, it's a quote that's on the main reading room wall at the Library of Virginia. It says, "We want to get wisdom. That is all we need. Let us get that, and we are made for time and eternity." And that was written by William Roscoe Davis, who was my great-great-great-grandfather, who was one of the very first contrabands at Fort Monroe, who knew Townsend, Baker, and Mallory, lived on the same block with two of them. And I'm just very proud of him and his history. And I also know that he was part of the colored convention that came to Alexandria in 1865 and met at the Lyceum. And it was funny because in researching the history of contrabands in Alexandria, our family was researching its own history at the same time. So we were kind of on parallel paths. And one of the things that we were very proud of during the pandemic, and when I think about William Roscoe Davis, is that my cousin, Anthony Davis, who's a composer, won the Pulitzer Prize for music for his opera on the Central Park Five. He and my cousin Talani Davis, who's a Grammy winner, worked on an opera in the 90s on Malcolm X, and the Metropolitan Opera is now bringing that opera back to New York. And I think about William Roscoe Davis, a contraband, an enslaved man who became a contraband, and his life and things that he fought for. He was the old lighthouse keeper at Old Point Comfort in Hampton, Virginia. But I think about him never imagining the heights that his family could reach. And that's why I say we're not just bound by the worst moments of our life, but we're bound by the achievement and the hope that we have for future generations. And one of the things they say about the contrabands at Fort Monroe, that was the first time that many white soldiers actually met someone who was enslaved. And they would write home saying, I'm learning this story. I'm learning about what it's like to be enslaved. And we know that those enslaved wanted just a better life, the opportunity for education, and to be an American citizen. And that's really what we all want. So I want to conclude on that, and thank you for your time. And I look forward to taking any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Audrey, so much for that powerful presentation. I learned so much about not only contrabands in general, but also about our own local history. For those of you who are joining on Zoom, you still have time to add your questions into the Q&A, but I also have some that I'll answer now. We can take some from the room too. Let's see. So the first question is, so how long did the contraband who arrived in the Alexandria area stay in Alexandria? Did they settle in the area or did they move on?
We know that a large number of them did actually settle in the area. And when Shar was doing her research, she could find many, many family ties. So a lot of the well-known names in Alexandria have a tie to that cemetery, including our former curator, Lillian Stanton Patterson, who is still working. She's our, I think, oldest city, I don't think she'll mind me saying this, she is our oldest working city employee at 95 years old, so she is amazing. But her family does date to the Contraband Cemetery as well.
All right, so the next question is, are there any estimates on the number of contraband getting into Alexandria during the war?
We don't, I mean, we know it's in the thousands, but we don't have, and we're still doing research, and as I said, right now we have so many people in our staff who are working, and one of my colleagues, I do want to mention him, Dr. Benjamin Skolnick. When I mentioned he's the gentleman who is working on the image of the woman in the courtyard. But if you'd like to see some of his work, you can go to our website, and he has done a deep dive into the history of 1315 Duke Street, which does include some of that contraband history. So you can find his full report to date on our website. Also, if you're interested in photography, Ben in February did an incredible lecture looking at 1315 Duke Street during the Civil War years, and you can find that lecture on our YouTube channel for the Office of Historic Alexandria. And if you want to know history of the domestic slave trade, you can also find video on our YouTube channel from Dr. Joshua Rothman, who is the chair of history at the University of Alabama, and was speaking on his new book, The Ledger and the Chain, which looks at the first dealer operating out of that site, the notorious Franklin and Armfield dealers. So you can find that information as well.
Thank you. So the next question is, you mentioned that escaped slaves were chained at Freedom House. How did that come to be?
Well, the last person, it is said, the last gentleman who was found enslaved there was left chained to the floor, and when the Union occupied, he was released, and that was the last enslaved person in Freedom House. We do know that in general, when you think about the complex at 1315 Duke Street, it's not the building so much. The building that you're seeing was really mainly the business office, but it took up the entire block. So there were pens where women were kept and pens where the men were kept. People have also asked us about our lower level, because many people who've been to the museum and went into the basement felt that slaves were held there. We do know the enslaved were in that area and in that basement, and we do know that it's referred to as the dungeon in some period writing, but we do feel that Franklin and Armfield, who would take people in coffles by foot to their hubs in Natchez and Louisiana, used that as an area of compliance. So it was probably an area of torture, but to get enslaved men ready to be taken as a coffle on foot. And so we're still investigating all the uses, but you can also find a deep dive study on the building and how the enslaved were held there on our website, and it was done by Smith Group last year.
Great. And then another question from our audience. Does Ms. Baugh's descendant research also include the 3 men who started the flow into the contraband camp?
No, because they were in Hampton. She was only looking at Alexandria. So I would actually be curious about their descendant research in Hampton if they've done that for Townsend, Baker, and Mallory. So.
Okay. So I'm going to combine 2 questions because
Sure.
they're a little bit similar. The term contrabands, how did that come to be, and where did the term freedmen's come from, and are they interchangeable or similar?
The contraband term was by it's attributed to General Butler, that it was a military term that he decided to make these 3 enslaved men contraband of war so that he could then use their labor to aid the Union cause. So I would say, first, it's a military definition popularized by Butler, who started that first in May of 1861. The other question, freedmen, you often see the term contraband and freedmen used kind of interchangeably. Also, there is debate on whether contraband should be used at all as a term. Some see it as a pejorative, but there are those of us who are contraband descendants who are proud of that name and so still use that name. But there has been scholarly debate about that and whether even the term contraband should be used still.
Thank you. I keep going to the people online, but if anyone in the room has a question, feel free to raise your hand, but I have a few more that are coming in. Sure. And the next question is, do you know how the experience of freedom seekers in Alexandria compares to those in other parts of the country?
I think in some cases they're very similar from what I've read and looking at contraband camps in DC and in other places. But if you'd like to get an idea of what, and you can do it today from your computer, if you go onto our Alexandria Archaeology website, we have transcribed the diaries of Julia Wilbur, who was there with Harriet Jacobs, and she details what's going on with the contrabands and what's happening in Alexandria and what daily life entailed for them. Also, the writings of Harriet Jacobs detail in great detail the suffering and how they're going out and begging for blankets and for clothing. And these 2 women, they also talk about the misogyny they faced often sometimes from the soldiers, because they would clean up a space and set it up and get it ready to take in contraband or get it ready for quarters for nurses, and then it would be commandeered by personnel, military personnel. So there was always that kind of frustration. But you see what they were dealing with and what it was like for the contraband men, women, and children. And one of the things they often said was that there were so many orphans, and we know that half the burials at our cemetery are children under the age of 16, that they were saying the surviving contraband mothers were always willing to take in another child and watch out for another child. So I think it's a very touching part of the story.
It is. Thank you. And then I guess the one more question that's coming in online is, how did the slaves make it to Alexandria, and why do you think Alexandria was chosen as a location as opposed to others in the north?
Well, absolutely it was chosen because the Union Army were there and they knew they had protection. It didn't mean that they were completely safe, because people could still come into Alexandria, claim that you belonged to them, and then remove you. So they were not like they were completely safe, and it wasn't like there were people who were coming in trying to reclaim escaped slaves, but we believe on wagon and really mostly by foot that they were coming. And I mean, it was, that if you're enslaved, you're not the healthiest person anyway, you're not getting full meals, and the fact that these people were traveling miles and miles and miles and are weak themselves and have labored so much, but it was so important for them to make it into freedom, and that's why we say they came seeking freedom but did not live long in it when we refer to them.
Thank you. And I think to wrap it up with our last question is, how can we visit these sites today if we're local in the area?
Well, absolutely. I encourage everyone to visit the Freedom House site. And if you're interested and a lover of history and want to be a part of it, we are starting focus groups for Freedom House and what we want to see within the next 3 years. Our goal is a museum to the domestic slave trade, but what does that mean? And so we started our first focus groups last month, and we're continuing. So we hope that if you're interested or you know a scholar that might be helpful, you will join us there. But you can visit the Freedom House Museum Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and Monday. And you can check the exact hours on our website. And the Black History Museum is Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. Thursday and Friday, 11 to 4. Saturday 11 until 5, and Sunday 1 until 5. And we hope that we'll see you not only at our two sites, the Freedom House and also the Black History Museum, but all 9 of our historic sites in the Office of Historic Alexandria.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
It was so great to have you and just to learn more about the topic.